Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library and welcome to Inkscape 2, continuing where we left off. In Inkscape 1, we learned how to install Inkscape. We discussed what vector graphics are and why you would want to use them versus raster graphics, and then we got into how to create and edit shapes and paths. In this class, we're going to learn about a few of the other tools, like the text tool, the snapping tool, the paint bucket tool, and a few others, basically whatever we can cover in about a half hour. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So we're starting on a new Inkscape document. If things look a little different, it might be because the bar over here on the right, the first bar, is across the top. But otherwise, things should look and function basically the same. We're going to start off with the text tool today. So I need to drag things away from the side to get to it because the recording software is in the way. But once you do, you've got the A selected, you've got some new options up at the top here, and the cursor has an A next to it. And what we want to do to add text to the document is simply click and start typing. You'll notice as I type, there's a blue dashed box that dynamically conforms to the text. There's also a little diamond in the lower right. So this diamond represents how long our line is. So if I shrink the length of the line, the words will wrap a little earlier. And the same goes the other way. So you'll notice that the box continues to change shape to contain the text. But that won't always be the case. You can also create a box that is a static size, and you do that by clicking and dragging to create the shape of your box. So when you do that and you start typing, you'll notice the box again keeps its shape, and instead we get a red outline that indicates that there's some overflow. So if you wanted to see everything you're typing, you'd have to either stretch the box out to contain all the text, or you can mess around with some of the options at the top here. So let's have a look at those. The first one is your style. Whatever font styles you have available is going to depend on what you have installed on your computer. You can install more, but that is beyond the scope of the class. The next box over is a few more style options. So italic, bold, bold italic, that should look familiar. What you have available here depends on the style. So not every style has the same options. Some will have more, some might not have any at all. Next box is your font size. So again, if we wanted things to fit in our box, we can choose a smaller size. You can also type in a size if you like. And beyond that, we've got line spacing, justification, superscript, subscript, letter spacing, word spacing, something called kerning, and letter rotation, which I obviously don't really use a whole lot. And often it's grayed out, indicating that the option isn't available. The final option here is the orientation. So you can go ahead and change the way the words are oriented. And that's that. So again, this is a text object in a text box. So if I choose the selection tool, the little arrow at the top here, you get the same options you would as if it was a shape. So you can stretch things out a little bit. Or if you click again, you get rotation options like that. Also, just like working with shapes, you can adjust the fill. We've got fill options down here. You can choose from the swatch here. There's a few more options. If you click on the arrow, it'll get you a different palette. Hold down Shift in order to change the stroke. So there you go. You've got a beige outline with a blue fill. And one last thing we can do here is change the object to a path. And once you do that, you can use the node editor. It's a little hard to see, but you can treat each letter like a path. The next topic I want to discuss is snapping, which is basically just a tool-assisted way of moving objects around on your document. So to demonstrate that, we need a few objects. I went ahead and drew a rectangle, an oval, and a path. You want to make sure you have your selection tool selected. And then to look at snapping options, we're basically looking at the far right here. So you'll notice we've got a little symbol here with a diamond pointing to another diamond, and that is repeated a couple times here. The topmost icon here is for universal snapping, so this will turn all snapping on and off. And within that, there's several groups here. The first group is the bounding box, which is the rectangle that encloses any object that you have on your document. The next group is nodes, and the last group is miscellaneous, which will include grid lines and guides, which we'll get into in just a sec. So I'm going to turn off all of the options except for the first one right now, and that is the bounding box. So with just the bounding box edges selected, I'm going to go ahead and grab an object and try to snap it to another. And you should notice that nothing happens. That's because snapping requires either a point or a node in order to snap to. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the bounding box corners, and now you'll notice as I approach the bounding box, the corners will want to snap to the edges. If I choose the next option, that's the midpoints. So now the midpoints will snap as well to the corners or side midpoints as well. So these are all selectable at once if you like. Still no. Now what about snapping to the midpoints? Now we've got some snapping going on. So what snapping happens will depend a lot on the object you're using and how you're moving them around. So you may need to mix and match. Again, the last group, you'll see it object midpoint. We've got the text baseline, but you'll probably want to use more than the others are the ones that are hidden here. If you don't see these on your page, you might have to click on the little arrow to see them. That's the page borders, grids, and guides. So page borders is a nice way to go right up to the edge of the document. For guides, all you need to do is click and drag on the rulers from the top or the left. You drag it onto your workspace. Now you can go ahead and use those to help move things around a bit. And if you wanted to work with the grid, you just need to go to View, select Page Grid, and there you go. So it really lends itself to experimentation. Go ahead and select one or more of your options and play around with it. And if you don't get things, the next topic I would like to discuss is duplicate and clone. Duplicate is just another way of copying and pasting, whereas cloning is something a little bit different. So if you typically wanted to copy and paste something, you would select it with the selection tool, click on copy, click on paste, and you'll get a copy in a somewhat central location. Click paste again, click paste again. I think you get the basic gist of it. I'm going to delete these copies. This time I'm going to use the keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to select the object, use Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, and you may notice that the copy is placed directly on top of my cursor. So if I move my cursor to the bottom left here, hit Control-V, you see the copy is centered over my cursor. So I'm going to delete these copies. This time I'm going to use duplicate. If I click the duplicate command, we want to make sure to select our object first. Duplicate. Now it looks like nothing happened, but that's because the copy was placed directly over the original. If I can click and drag, you can clearly see we've got a copy. I'll use duplicate again. Click and drag, and there you go. These duplicates are completely independent of each other, so you can go ahead and move around the height, the width, change the rotations, change the colors, change the path. And it should behave exactly as you'd expect. So I'm going to delete these guys. This time I'm going to use clone. So the cloning command is the stacked squares with a lock on it. With an object selected, I'm going to click clone, drag away. I'm going to click on the original, click clone again, drag it away. So these are clones. You can see we can do what we did before, changing the height and the width and the rotation. However, if I try to change the color or edit the path, I can't. The nodes don't even show up. The color's in the lower left there. You can see the fill is changing, but nothing is happening on my clone. That's because clones have their color and their shape directly tied to its original. So I'm going to select the original here, change its color, and you can see it's reflected in the clones. If I want to edit the path, it's the same thing. So you can't edit certain features of the clones. However, if you adjust something like the color or the path in the original, it will be reflected in all of the clones. If you wanted to break that tie, you can go ahead and select a clone, and next to the cloning command is the command to break the clone link. And once you click on that, the clone becomes its own individual object. And you can go ahead and change its color and edit its path. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of our clones. Select our original object. I'm going to make a clone. And I'm going to make a clone of a clone. So with a clone and a clone of a clone, you can go ahead and make changes to the original just as you did before and see those changes reflected in all of the clones. And just like before, you can't do any of the editing in the other clones either. However, let's say we take our first clone and we break the ties. Changing our original won't do anything. However, if we start changing our clone, you can still see it retains command over its own clone. So you break the chain, but the clone in the middle still retains kind of ownership over all the clones down the chain. So it's a useful functionality if you wanted to, say, make lots of stars or lots of tires on a truck. You can use the clones as a way of making copies and then having it where you can just make changes to the original and then not have to do a lot of cutting and pasting to make further changes. Next up is the paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool acts a lot like it does in Photoshop or Paint, but not quite. I will demonstrate. So to start off, you want to make sure nothing is selected and then select the paint bucket tool. After that, we go ahead and select our color from the bottom. There's plenty to choose from, and if you don't like what you see, there's a bunch of other palettes. If you click on the little arrow on the far right, you can go ahead and select another palette. I'm not going to do that though. I'm going to stick with the Inkscape default palette, and we'll go ahead and choose green. So when you choose the fill for your paint bucket tool, it will be set in the upper right corner here. You'll also notice there's a stroke. I will explain that in just a bit. Typically, you'd want to leave that unset though. So with our paint bucket selected and our color selected, we want to go ahead and, let's say, fill in this circle with green or oval with green. Go ahead and click in there, and that does kind of what you'd expect, right? You'd fill the color in, except not quite. If I choose the selection tool, click and drag, you'll notice what actually happened is we created a whole another object on top of the area we were trying to fill. And that's the trick with the Inkscape paint bucket, is you're not actually changing any fills, you're actually creating a new object over the fill area. What I understand happens is Inkscape basically turns the whole screen into a raster image, and then it traces out the area that you selected and then creates a new image from that. And because of that, the behavior is a little unusual. So if I go ahead and put the fill back and zoom in, you'll notice that I didn't even fill the whole shape quite right. There's still a little bit of yellow sneaking in through the sides. So to mitigate something like that, I'm going to go ahead and delete this fill. What you can do, select the paint bucket. You can increase the threshold, which basically lets the colors vary by a little bit more before the color is cut off. You can also grow and shrink the object that you're creating with the fill to try to fill in those extra gaps. And something that might not be intuitive, but because of how Inkscape is basically doing a trace, zooming in will help you better fill an object. So if you zoom in a bit, maybe grow your shape by a little bit, then fill in your shape, and now you can see there's no yellow showing through. It does a lot better. So those are some tips to pay attention to as far as trying to fill things in a little bit better. Is increasing the threshold, growing the shape just a little bit, and zooming in. So to have another look at threshold, down here we have a gradient, and with the threshold at 5, that's pretty low. If I go to fill this in, it fills in just a little bit of the rectangle here. I'm going to undo that and increase the threshold to something closer to, let's say, 50. And now when I do it, it fills in a whole bunch more of the gradient. So that's another trick for filling in areas that don't seem to be getting filled in all the way. With something like the shape on the right here, where you see we clearly have a gap, if I try to fill this in, we'll get an area that says area is not bounded, cannot fill. That's because you can't even change the color of the background with the paint bucket. So even if you were to do something like this, I'm clicking outside of all the shapes, it doesn't do anything. You can't change the background with the paint bucket. It won't let you. So to fill in this shape here, again, you can try zooming in, but that's only going to make the gap bigger. But we have this option at the top here for closing gaps. So here you can go ahead and we'll set the close gaps to large. Click on the shape here. Still no luck. We can try zooming out, and that works because zooming out actually shrinks that gap on the screen. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense and isn't ideal, but that is how the Inkscape paint bucket works. Next, I'd like to talk about gradients. Gradients are just a fill that mix 2 or more colors together. It's not like the paint bucket where you're creating new objects or filling in gaps or anything like that. So there's 2 ways you can go about creating a gradient on an object. The first way is to select the object with the selection tool. You can select multiple if you like. Then choose the gradient tool. And with an object selected and the gradient tool selected, just click and drag. And when you do, you'll create your gradient. Where you click and where you release will create 2 stops. Each stop has its own color, and as a function of the gradient, they get blended in the middle. If you wanted to change the color of your stops, just click on it and choose a new color from the bottom. Do the same thing on the other side here. There you go. You can also move these stops around. They don't have to stay within the bounds of the selected objects. It's up to you. If you wanted to play around with it a little bit more, what you can do is go to Object, Fill in Stroke, and here you have a little bit more control over the colors. So if you wanted to select one of the stops, let's say lower the alpha or the transparency, you can do that and get another effect. Something else you can do is add more stops. So go ahead and select one of the stops. It can't be the circle though. If you have multiple stops, it's fine as long as you're selecting a square. And then click the little plus sign here where it says Insert New Stop. And what that will do is create a new stop in between the one that you selected and the next one, and it will also blend the properties of the two stops together. So this stop, as you can see, is purple and has a medium transparency. We can go ahead and change that though. Change it to yellow. That's interesting. You can create more stops if you want. Start to lose the effect if you get a little too crazy though. If you want to delete a stop, select it, click on the minus sign there, and you get rid of your stops. So that's one way you can create a gradient. Another way is by selecting an object, then go to Object, Fill and Stroke, and here you can go ahead and choose a new gradient. You have linear gradient, you have radial gradient, you have mesh gradient, which can get pretty crazy, so I'm not going to really talk about it here, but it's fun to experiment with. So we'll have a look at the radial gradient on this one. I'm going to click Radial Gradient. And then we'll just have to go ahead and select the gradient tool. And you can see where it creates the gradients. It goes straight to the edges on the top and on the side. And we can go ahead, click on those stops and change their colors. So the stop on the right and the stop on the top are going to be the same, so you can't change those independently. You can, however, play around with the length of the axis. Of your radial gradient. You can also move the center of it if you like, and it doesn't even have to be on the shape itself. I lost it. And that is a brief look into gradients. The next topic I want to discuss is the stacking order, or Z order. So basically, every time you create a new object, it stacks on top of the objects that came before it. This kind of behavior isn't something that you always want. You'll usually create something and want it to go beneath something else that's already there. And so to send something below things that are already created, what you would need to do is use the selection tool, select the object, and go to the object menu. And then halfway down, we've got some options here. Raise to top, raise, lower, and lower to bottom. There's also some shortcut keys associated with those that I'm going to use in just a sec. So with the yellow rectangle selected, I'm going to select lower from the menu, and you can see that the yellow rectangle was sent below the previously placed object, but still above everything else. I'm going to use the page up and page down buttons now to go up and down the stacking order one at a time. If I hit the end key, it jumps straight to the bottom. Home key goes straight to the top. And that's all there really is to it. So if you ever needed to change the order that things are stacked in, you can just go ahead and use the page up and page down buttons to send an object up or down. If you think there might be something hidden, you can go to the object menu and click Objects, and it will show you everything that is currently on the workspace. So in case you can't find something, this would be a way of going and finding it. You can see the outlines of the rectangles behind everything that's in front of it. I'm going to close that for now. Another way we can adjust what is in front and below things is with layers. So most drawing programs nowadays have layers, If you wanted to create a new layer, all you would do is go to Layer, Add a Layer. You can name your layer. I'm going to name it Top so we know where it is. You can choose if it goes above or below the current layer, and because I'm naming it Top, I'm going to go above. Click Add, and now we have a top layer, and we're currently placing objects in that top layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and create one giant rectangle, make it orange, and this rectangle is now on the top layer. If I hit page down or end, it doesn't matter. It might be at the bottom of the stack, but it's at the bottom of the stack on the top layer. So anything on the layer above something will always be in front of something on the layer below. So I might like my big orange rectangle, but it's kind of blocking the way of everything. So if I wanted to see what's on the layer below, all I gotta do is click on the eye, and now the top layer objects become invisible. So even though that might be the case, all the objects are still in play. You can still move things around even if you're on the top layer here. Everything on the layers below will still be selectable. So that's something to be aware of. If you don't want that to be the case, what you would do is lock that layer. So I'm on the top layer here, but I don't want to actually move anything on the bottom layer. So what I would do is go to layer 1 and lock it. And now when I go up to the top layer, make it visible, I can go ahead and move things around and not worry about moving anything on the layers below it. So if you start to get lost, maybe you have too many layers that you're having track of what's on each layer or where the layers are relative to each other, you can just click Layer and then Layers at the top there, and you can see the different layers and what their status is regarding the visibility and whether or not they're locked. So that's a quick look into Z order and layers, and that's all I'm going to cover for today. I hope you learned something. I hope I've piqued your interest to learn a bit more. Thank you for joining me today, and have a good day.